Hello and welcome to this Coralogix training video. Today we're going to explore alerts in Coralogix. So alerts are a functionality in Coralogix that enables you to define specific alarms. So for example, when a threshold has been crossed, or a given latency has exceeded a certain amount, or the number of error logs or info logs has exceeded a certain count, you'll be able to fire alerts, and these alerts can send you Slack messages, emails, integrate with custom webhooks, and much more. We'll see well into that. And what this enables you to do is to essentially give your data a voice. So if you see a problem on a dashboard, that's one thing, but it's another thing if your system can tell you. And alerts are really powerful because you can define multiple levels of alerts, and there are many different ways of laying out your alerts and different strategies to optimize for different outcomes. Today we're going to really focus on the different types of alerts that exist in Coralogix, because there are quite a few and they all have different strengths, so it's important to know which one to apply to which scenario. After that, we're going to dive into notifications and webhooks and explain how those different webhooks work, and then we're going to go into a troubleshooting section where we talk about some of the frequently asked questions that our customer support engineers see, as well as some of the little pro tips that are going to make it really great for you to use each of the different types, and some use cases for how each different alert works. So it's going to be a nice long video where we're going to really cover a great deal of ground. I'd recommend using the chapters in this video if you want to find your ideal location, because this is going to be a lot of information to get through. So we can begin with the different types of alerts and the way to navigate to alerts. So navigating to alerts in Coralogix is really easy. It's right at the top here. So once you've signed into your account, you just click on alerts. And what you'll see is this really nice dashboard. This is a breakdown of all of the alerts that are fired. Alerts can have different severities, so you can see here the breakdown of severities at different times. And also on the right-hand side here, you can see the most frequent alarm. So this particular one has fired 639 times in the past 12 hours. That's very busy. And then you can see here all of your different alarms and the different types here, the different severities, whether they're active or inactive. Of course, inactive alerts will not fire. And when they were last triggered, and you also have the ability here to snooze the alert, as well as a series of filters here that you can use in the typical way. Let's dig into the different types of alerts. So before we deep dive into any of the specific alert types, let's have a look at some of the general configuration that can be applied to almost all alerts, so we can understand how best to notify people, the different channels on which we can notify, scheduling alerts, and much, much more. So we're on the new alert screen again. We're going to scroll straight past all of the alert types, the specific configuration for the standard alert type that we've got highlighted. You'll notice this changes based on the different values you've selected. We'll stick to standard because it's simplest. So the first thing we'll look at is notification groups. So what notification groups are is a way of routing this alert to different recipients. Okay, so to start with, you always have a single default notification group with a single webhook, the Coralogix application. What this specific thing does is it will inform the Coralogix application of an alert. It's kind of looping back on itself. This will update things like the insight screen, which we'll discuss in another video, but it just makes sure that the Coralogix platform is kept up to date with these alerts. You can add further webhooks to this notification group if you don't want to do anything more specific than that. So you can easily pick from a variety of different webhooks that already exist. There are lots of webhooks already. You can actually view them if you come out of here, data flow, and go to webhooks here. You'll see that you have a bunch of predefined webhooks already, and then you have webhooks that you can think. So in here, you can actually specify different endpoints. You can specify different JSON bodies. So you can see here we've actually specified the JSON body. So remember that the predefined webhooks are always all very flexible. The predefined webhooks are inflexible, that you just give it an endpoint to hit, or you give it a key, and it will automatically send out to that appropriate endpoint. The webhook type is for custom endpoints. So if you want to invoke a script via a HTTP call, API gateway in AWS, that kind of thing, that's the place to go. So we'll make our way back to alerts here. Go to new alert, and that's notification groups. But what you can do is you can add extra notification groups, and this is where things get kind of cool, actually. So what you can do is, if you write a query, you can actually write a query and group it by a specific thing. So I'll give you an example. Let's group by application name, for lack of a better one. So now what I've essentially said is I've grouped by application name. So now anytime, so I will essentially get an alert for each unique application name. And if I go down here, I can now set up a notification group on that grouping. So what that means is for each individual application name, I can add different webhooks. And I can add specific notification groups for different keys. So if you have multiple groupings, which you can do here, then you can set up different keys here as well. And you can have different recipients of data as well. So you could have, for example, webhooks for this group, webhooks for this group. So it's a really powerful way of routing this alert, essentially. Then you have schedule. So if an alert is only relevant, for example, during business hours, or you only want to be told about it at midnight because your daytime has a different system, you can set that up here. So essentially you're defining when it will and won't fire. You can disable this functionality by hitting the limit triggering. Notification content will actually structure the message itself. So rather than just dumping the default thing, you might want to say, okay, I want to see the data from some specific JSON fields that exist in the log. And I don't want to have to worry too much about the rest of it. So there's application name and so on. That's up to you to define. The standard one is pretty good, but this way you can specify specific values and really tailor that experience. Finally, the verify alert. So this isn't a configuration, but this is available on some alert types. What you can do is you can define a query here. If you define a query up top, for example, let's add a specific application. Let's set the default app, or maybe that's a bit busy. We'll do Prometheus. And you verify again. You'll notice now it's different. So what this is essentially saying is this is all of the times in the past 24 hours that this alert would have fired. And what this enables you to do is to define your alarm, and you don't have to wait if you've got it right. So if you know, okay, this thing happened at midnight or like 6 p.m. yesterday, go back, verify the alert, and look at 6 p.m. yesterday, and you'll see, okay, yeah, it did fire, cool, we would have covered that. So it's a really, really powerful tool there. Remember, this verify alert is not available for all alert types, though, so just be aware that if it's not there, it's not available for that. So those are some of the generic configurations that can be applied to all alerts. Next, we're going to dig into a few of the alert types. So we're going to look at standard, and we're going to look at metric, and then we're going to dig into some of the specific configurations that are available around grouping and things like that. So just to recap, we've just covered notification groups. We've covered some of the grouping, which can be done on some of the alert types. We've covered different notification groups and what that means. We've covered schedules, covered notification content, and we've looked at this verify alert feature to decide what that means and how it's useful and why it's so important when you're defining your alerts. So let's get moving. So let's explore the alert types in Coralogix. The way to do this is to click on the New Alerts button up here. So this is from the Alerts dashboard. When you click on New Alerts, you'll be presented with a modal. All alerts can be given the same metadata, alert name, description, severity, and labels. As you scroll down, you'll see the different alert types. Let's go through each one, as well as a cool little use case that can be applied to each type. Standard alerts are really straightforward. They just count the number of logs that match a given query and filters. Really useful if you wish to count things like number of errors produced by an application. So really simple, really basic, but really powerful. Ratio alerts are really cool. So these will count two different logs and measure the ratio between them. So a really, really nice use case here is error rates. I'll give you an example. Let's say for every successful request, you get an info level log, and for every unsuccessful request, you get an error level log. What you can do is you can measure the ratio of the error logs to the info level logs, and this will give you a percentage. This will give you an idea. So you could say, more than 10% of logs from this application are coming out as errors. That gives me a 10% error rate. I want to know about that. So a really, really nice use case for the ratio alert. New value alert will trigger on a value if it has never been seen before. So this is really important. This will enable you to detect things like IP addresses that haven't been picked up before. So if you have a closed system and a new IP address appears, you wish to know about it. Of course, you can also specify the time range as well. So unique values, unique count will be it's very similar to standard in the sense that you're counting the number of log entries returned from a given query. But what you do is you group them by a given key. So I'll give you an example. You could have application name here. So group them by application name and count. So for example, if one application if the number of applications increases by, let's say, exceeds 16 within 30 minutes, then trigger an alarm. This is a really nice way of keeping track of individual values. One thing you could do here, really nice use case, IP addresses again. You could be detecting activity per IP address, and if a new IP address appears, again, you could do that. You could also check for things like different types of alerts, different severities. There's lots of different ways to slice this one. Time relative. So what this will do is it will measure the increase over time. So for example, you can say, if my alarm has increased by 100 entries compared to the last hour, tell me about it. So this is really nice, especially for detecting sudden spikes in traffic. So for example, let's say it's perfectly normal for you to expect a fluctuation of 100 logs in a given time frame, in any time frame over the day. You might want to say, okay, let's make this 200 then. That's well above. So if the ratio is more than, also it can be less than. 200 compared to the previous hour. So that's an increase of 200 in the previous hour. Tell me about it. Of course, you can also group it as well by a given key. This is the same for all alerts as well. We'll get into grouping after this, after we've gone through all the different types. Metric alerts enable you to define a PromQL query, and you can define alarms based on the values of those metrics. Really, really powerful. There's lots and lots of different ways to configure this. So after we've gone through the highlights, we're going to dive into metric alerts because they have a great deal of power and a great deal of configurability. You define a PromQL query. You can define different conditions. So, for example, you can say if the value of the metric is more than 10 for over 10% of the last minute. So that means at least over 10% of the last 10 minutes means at least 1 minute matched this threshold in the past 10 minutes. There are some nuances to that, and we'll cover those nuances because they're going to fall into the troubleshooting section. But a basic analysis is that 10% of the last 10 minutes essentially means within the last 10 minutes, at least 1 minute matched our threshold. And in here, of course, you can expect to write the PromQL query, get a nice autocomplete there. So it's just a really, really powerful way of implementing this. Tracing alerts are driven by tracing data. So a really, really nice use case for tracing alerts is to measure latency, to track SLOs. Really, really common use cases to track SLOs here. So you can track, this is really powerful actually. If you wanted to with tracing alerts, you could say, okay, all of my applications must respond in under 500 milliseconds. If they are higher than 500 milliseconds, anything in my system, and more than that, and there has to be a certain, so if you get like random outliers, that's not too bad. But let's say 500 spans at least in the past 10 minutes are higher than 500 milliseconds, tell me about it. This is a really nice way of a system-wide SLO. And then, of course, you can make this more specific, so you can zoom in on different applications, you can zoom in on different subsystems, specific services attached to the span, as well as different actions. So you could say, for example, actually, what's really, really important to me is this get quote endpoint. This is the one that actually really matters. I don't care what system it is, I don't care what the service is. All I care is that every request to this particular endpoint, this particular action, is faster than 500 milliseconds. That has to happen. And yeah, so this is a really, really powerful way of defining alerts around SLOs and SLIs, as well as error use cases as well. You could just say that your system has hard timeouts of 2 seconds. So if you're hitting that 2-second mark, there's a chance that you're getting some serious issues there. So really, really powerful way of tracking system performance. Finally, flow alerts. Flow alerts are really cool. We're going to do more of a deep dive into those now. So flow alerts are essentially a way of chaining together multiple different alerts into a single story. So where typically you would get an alert that says the database CPU has reached 95%. So okay, I know where the problem is, but I have no idea what the events were that led up to that. So with flow alerts, what you can do is you can say, okay, my journey kind of starts at my S3 bucket. And then what happens next is if the S3 slows down, do I get any traces, for example? Slow front-end traces. If S3 slows down, slow front-end traces. So if my S3 alarm fires and then my traces are slower within the next 10 minutes, and then what happens is error rates increase. So we could say more than usual 400 errors, for example. you'll notice here that this is a mix of log and tracing type alarms. This is because flow alerts are a completely unique type of alert. It's essentially one alarm defined around logs, metrics, traces, and security data. So this enables you to define these really complex, really sophisticated stories without having to worry too much about the underlying alarm. So it's actually a really nice way for users to engage with alarms that already exist. There's loads and loads of different things you can do here, but a really nice use case is when you're trying to bake the root cause in. And once you've actually defined this, you can apply that, and you can see a preview here. A typical name for a flow alert might be something like now consider the difference here. Before we were talking about the endpoint, so our normal alert might be slow front-end performance. Now what we're saying is an S3 outage has caused slow front-end performance. So you're not seeing the alarm and hunting for the root cause, you're being told the root cause straight away. It's a really, really powerful tool. Strongly recommend that all users engage with this and try it out, because it means that it's a really nice way of some of those critical paths to the system. You can wrap alerts around them straight away, these flow alerts, and then you know instantly when it happened, okay, I know exactly what's happened, I know what's gone wrong here. And of course, they can be grouped by key as well, so you can have a specific collection of different fields in the logs or in metrics or something that you want to split this alert on, you can do that as well. So really powerful, really clean, and in my opinion, it's kind of the jewel of the alerting features here, because it ties all of the different other kinds of alarms together. So that was a run through of the different types of alerts and a deep dive into flow alerts. We're now going to explore configuring some of these alerts more deeply. We're not going to dive into all of them because there are some similarities between them. But we are going to dive into standard alerts because that has some configuration details, metric alerts, and then we're going to go into the troubleshooting section of the video. Okay, so let's explore the standard alert type. So we're going to dive into this particular alert. Once again, the standard alert type is all about counting the number of logs that match a given query, and then deciding more than or less than. So as with all alerts, you have this metadata at the top, the name, the description, the severity of the alert, and any labels. By the way, labels are really handy if you want to do things like define just cross-purpose labels like SLO or database or front-end application, that kind of thing. It's just a nice way of grouping things. One thing to note that when you're, we'll talk about this later, but there's a difference in clear and delete permanently. So when you're configuring the standard alert, the big thing is around the query. Okay, so this is a Lucene query, so you can implement anything you want. For example, you could say, I don't know, you've got all these different fields here. So some of them have constant on them, like constant name. You could say anything like this, for example. So you can kind of have that. You can get rid of the quotes. Remember, it's just anything you can do with a Lucene query, you can do with this. So you can have this query. On top of this, you can then also filter by application and subsystem. This is a good idea. Make your query as specific as possible, because then it just minimizes the chances of other logs making their way in and causing false positives on your alarm. Then you can obviously specify application subsystem as well as log severity as well. So for example, I only want to alert on error logs, for example, coming out of Asia. Then you have some conditions down here. So firstly, more than. So more than is really straightforward. You say more than, let's say, 100 occurrences in 10 minutes. That means in a 10-minute time window, if there are more than 100 logs, then trigger an alarm. Really straightforward. Less than is the same but opposite. So if there are less than 100 occurrences in a 10-minute time window, then trigger. Notify immediately has no threshold or time window. As soon as this query returns any logs, trigger. And finally, there's more than usual. More than usual, super sophisticated. This is using a machine learning model to actually profile your data. So one thing to note here is that when you're using the more than usual feature, there is a 7-day sort of learning period where the alert is going to work out what your normal profile is. After that, the alert will begin to work. So more than usual, the minimum threshold is 100 there. So this is basically saying, let's say last week there were 50. This week there are 75. That won't trigger the alarm. It will only trigger if there's like 100 more than what one would normally expect. So more than usual, that's last week 50, this week is 175, that will trigger. If it's 151, that will trigger, but 149 won't. So you have to decide what an abnormal variance is. Another thing to point out as well with the more than usual alert type is that it works best with data that's kind of continuous. So if there's like a sporadic logs 1 hour and then nothing for 8 hours and another sporadic set of logs, it might not profile the data as effectively. Whereas continuous logs that are, an application that's constantly changing and pushing out logs all the time, that's the perfect kind of data profile for this kind of alarm. So just something to be aware of. Then of course you have your group by key. We discussed this in the previous section, but the group by key will enable you to group this alarm based on a given key or a given field. You'll notice that for more than and less than, you have a 2-level grouping. For more than usual, just a 1-level grouping. So we'll look at the 2-level grouping. Here you can say, okay, group by application name and also group by subsystem, for example, Coralogix metadata subsystem. So that's application name and subsystem. So you'll get one alarm or one alert, one email, one notification per application name and subsystem name. So think of the groupings. The groupings are always really, really important. It's crucial that you make sure you understand what the appropriate groupings are, because if you don't do any groupings, obviously at that point it's like a raw output. So every single individual unique value may trigger an alarm, and that may cause alert spam and alert fatigue, which is all negative outcomes of too many alarms firing. You'll notice there's time window settings here. So what we've essentially said in this alarm is that if there are more than 100 occurrences within 10 minutes, then trigger. Now, there are 2 ways that this can be evaluated. The first is a rolling window. So let's say that I've configured my alarm to trigger every minute. It's an important one. Now, in a given 10-minute window, there are 105 occurrences of this given query, or 105 logs that match this query. It's like, okay, trigger the alarm. Now, because you've set every minute, the next minute comes round, Coralogix is once again going to reevaluate your data. It's going to look at the previous 9 minutes plus the new 1 minute that's just passed. It essentially is reevaluating all those old logs plus the extra 1 minute. Okay, so this is what the rolling window does, and what it means is that you are going to get alarms potentially for most of the same set of logs. Okay, whereas dynamic duration will take into account when the last alarm fired. So if the alarm fires and then it checks again in a minute, like because of the notify every set at 1 minute, when it checks again, it won't take into account that previous 9 minutes because it already knows an alarm has fired to cover that data. It will try and wait it out. So this will affect how things are checked. So really, it's up to you. I would say that if you want to behave in the way that most alerting platforms function is with rolling window. So they will take old logs that have already been alerted onto account. But sometimes you have use cases where you don't want repeated alerts for data. So for example, alerts that are checking for sudden changes. For example, if your alert is checking for a sharp increase in data in volume, log volume, then the rolling window may not be the one for you, because that changes. You've already alerted on the fact that the change has happened, and if you have a rolling window, you may keep alerting on the same change, whereas dynamic duration will take that into account and not alert on that data. So that's just something to be aware of. It's an important configuration, but it may have an impact on how your alarm is functioning. We already covered notification groups and schedule, notification content in the previous section. We already covered verify alert. You'll notice that 0 alerts were generated for this particular data for this particular query and set of filters. So if I remove that filter, nothing from the agent content essentially, which is great. And you'll notice here that we have this grouping. Now, one thing to note is that if you use the group by functionality and you use keys that don't exist on the logs for which you have specified in your query, then your alarm will never fire. Okay, it won't all get put into one group. The groups will essentially cancel out and your alarm will never fire. So make sure that these keys that you use for your group by exist on the logs that you've specified. Okay, super important that you get that, otherwise you'll have a non-functioning alarm. So that's all the different ways that one can configure the standard alert. Next we'll look at metrics. There are a few different nuances there. for how long alerts should be defined, and also things about evaluation periods and that kind of thing. So let's dive into the metric alert type now. The metric alert type enables you to trigger alerts based on metric values. So for our PromQL query, we can look at things like load time, for example, and we can query on different values that exists in load time as well. So what this will do is it'll give me only the Prometheus metrics for the load time with a value of continent of Asia. So it's just a standard PromQL dialog. If you're unfamiliar with PromQL, there is a wealth of information out on the internet and also on the Coralogix site as well. And you can also see a link off to the PromQL documentation right here in the UI as well. So you can see here that the Prometheus documentation is really accessible. So if you're unsure, just try out that link. You'll notice some similar conditions again, more than, less than, more than usual. So this functions very similarly to the standard alert type that we discussed before, only rather than it being the count of a given metric or anything like that, it's the actual metric value. So more than, so let's say it's a latency metric, 100 for, let's say, 10% of the last 10 minutes. That means over the last 10-minute span, there has to have been at least 1 minute where the metric exceeded the value of 100. Now, there are some nuances to this that we need to understand. There can be times when there is missing values in your data. And what you need to do is understand how you want to deal with this. So metrics can often have missed samples. It happens a lot on for various different reasons. So the big one is, let's say you've got a 10-minute time window. Now, for 50% of that time, you were sending data, and 50% of that time you weren't sending data. Data is missing. Now, by default, what Coralogix will do is it will look at that 10-minute window and say, okay, only 5 minutes of it has data. So now we effectively have a 5-minute window. So where before we said that it's a 10-minute time window and 10%, and that means 1 minute there must be 1 minute's worth of samples that exceed the value. Because half of your data is missing, the whole time window becomes 5 minutes. Therefore, the requirement is now 30 seconds of that time window exceeds it. And that's because of the missing data. Now, if you don't like this behavior, what you can do, you can tick this box here, and this will replace the missing values with 0. And what that will do is that any time a sample is missing, it becomes 0. So you're always evaluating on a 10-minute time frame. The only problem with this, of course, is that 0 might be significant to you for some reason. So, for example, it could be that you want a metric to make sure that your sales are over a certain amount and that kind of thing, and you don't want that number to hit 0, or you trigger an alarm because that might be an indication that something's wrong with the website. So in this case, what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to decide what like a good quality sample of my data is. So you can say, for example, okay, measure the time frame of the last 10 minutes and only trigger an alarm if the condition is met and at least 90% of that time frame is filled with data. So if you have a situation where we discussed before where half of the data is missing and half is present, then you won't trigger an alarm on that. That's kind of like a quality control thing for you. Once again, you can preview the alert. So there's no condition there, so you can do that. But if we just do that, so any load time, when we refresh, you'll see here all the different times, all the different values for this alert, and you can see those lines there indicating when the alarm would have fired. So this threshold of 100 essentially means that you would have a lot of alarms firing for this thing. Now, this is for more than usual. As one might expect, it's very, very similar to the logs. So if the value of the metric is higher than what it normally is, then this will trigger an alarm. Again, you have the for over 10% of the last 5-10 minutes or whatever, and a minimum requirement of the data. Strongly recommend that you set the minimum requirement, the minimum data requirement for that time frame to something high, like 90%. That just guarantees that there's something strange going on. So we've looked at more than and more than usual. Then we have less than. So for less than, you have a similar situation. The value is less than 100 for 10% over the last 10 minutes. There is, however, a situation where you have undetected values. So what are undetected values? So let's say you've got a metric with 10 different labels on there. So for example, you have one metric per country in which you operate. One of those countries is, for argument's sake, let's say it's the UK. Now, that UK metric stops delivering, stops sending. This may indicate that the value is missing or something, and it becomes an undetected value. And you have to decide what you're going to do about undetected values. So if you say replace missing values with 0, then the problem kind of solves itself in terms of the 90% time frame. What you can do is you can completely disable trigger on undetected values. So that means that if a metric stops coming through, then it won't trigger the alarm. Or what you can do is you can set a retirement period. So for example, an hour. And what that means is that it will trigger for that hour, but then after that, it will stop triggering on the undetected value. This is very specific to your use case, so I'd strongly just have a think, do you want to alert if data for a given permutation of labels stops coming through or not? That's kind of up to you. But this is something to be very aware of because it's a specific nuance for metrics and standard alerts as well, but it's not as common with standard alerts. It's usually with the metric alerts that we see the most engagement there. So it's just something to be aware of when you're configuring these alarms. As usual, metric alerts come with all of the normal things that one might expect. So you get this nice alert preview with all the different values, and it shows when that would have triggered. You can see the notification groups, as we discussed before, and the schedule, as we discussed before. So that was the standard alert type and the metric alert type. So there's a deep dive of two of the big alert types. So next, we're going to go into troubleshooting. I'm going to go through a list of the most common problems that people experience. And hopefully this will mean this video gives you a really nice, well-rounded experience, a deep dive into standard and metric alerts, an awareness of all the alert types, and after the next section, a decent understanding of some of the most common problems you're going to run into, so you're really well prepared to start your alerting journey in Coralogix. So now we're going to dig into the troubleshooting section. What we're going to do is just go through some of the really common problems that Coralogix customers experience, and hopefully answer some of the questions that you've got and help you to preempt some of the problems that you might run into when you're using the alerting feature here in Coralogix. So the first one is really straightforward. When you're defining a new alarm, it takes about 15 minutes for that alarm to become like embedded into the platform. So if you do define an alarm, wait 15 minutes, go get a coffee or something, wait 15 minutes, and then have a look and see if it's triggering, because that will mean that it's definitely active. And that's just something to be aware of. You know, alarms don't work instantly as soon as you define them, but it's only 15 minutes, and at which point they will begin to work normally, roughly 15 minutes anyway. The next thing is about how you define your alarms. A really common problem that customers have is they define a query in here, like they'll say, I don't know, so I want to zoom in on a namespace, for example, and then, so I've got my Kubernetes namespace here, and then they will pick an application and a subsystem that does not fit in that namespace. And essentially their query and their application and subsystem filters, or their severity subsystem filters, they're not working together, and you end up with no data. So it's really, really important to make sure that firstly you check your query. You can take this for logs, for example. You can take this and you can go to the explore screen and you can place the log in here, and you can just make sure that you actually have data available. So that's a nice way of just verifying that your data is working as expected. Otherwise, you may find that your alerts aren't really working in the way that you intended, and that's because your alarms and your filters are working against one another. The next common problem that people have is around the less than use case. So there are some nuances here that we need to be aware of. The first is that let's say I want to know about 100 occurrences, less than 100 occurrences in 1 hour. Now, before we said that at the start, we said that it takes 15 minutes for an alert to become active. This is true, but for a less than use case, the alert won't fire until the initial time window has passed. So you've said an hour, it will be an hour at least before this time window passed. And this makes sense because you want to check that less than 100 occurrences have happened within an hour. So an hour has to pass in order to be certain that less than 100 occurrences have happened. For example, you could have 90 occurrences, or you could have 0 occurrences right up until the 59th minute, and then 200 occurrences could happen in the last minute. So you have to wait for the initial time window to pass. The other thing to be aware of with the less than log queries, less than for log queries and for metrics as well, is that when you're defining your notification time window here, so your notify every or notification group. So the number of times that you should fire for an alarm or check the alert and fire a new alarm if it's still true. Should be cannot be or should basically be the same as your notification group. So for example, if you set this to an hour, you'll notice that it automatically changes to an hour. And again, this kind of makes sense. You don't want to check every 5 minutes that there's been less than 100 occurrences in an hour, because you're going to be constantly reviewing the same data and over again. So when you're setting the time window, it needs to be the same as the notify every window. It won't let you create the alerts if they're different. So that's just something to be aware of. That's the reason why you're not seeing that. For the more than usual type, be aware that it takes a week for the alarm type to process and profile all your data from initial creation, so it won't be active for a week. But once it is active, the reason for this is to prevent false positives, by the way. If we start triggering an alarm too soon, it might not know enough information to make an accurate assessment. So that profiling has to happen first. And we mentioned this before, but I'll just mention it again. If you have an application that produces like sporadic logs, you're just like a few logs 1 minute and then nothing for 5 hours and some more logs, it won't work that well with the more than usual alert type. It's much better with an application that's producing lots and lots of logs all the time, constantly. So that's just something to be aware of when you're defining the more than usual alert type. The next problem that people sometimes face is adding labels. So I'll select a label here, SLO. Now, when I close this off, I have two options: clear and delete permanently. Clear means remove this label from this alert. Delete permanently means delete this label from all alerts, okay? This is a big one, and you'll notice a second prompt comes up to make sure you're completely aware of this. Do you want to delete this label from all alerts? Be aware of that, okay? Because if you delete it from all of the alerts, there's no undoing that. So you have to go back and add that label to all of the appropriate alerts. So just be aware of that and make sure that you don't make that mistake of undoing some of your hard work there. The next thing we're going to dig into, so while we were discussing the metrics alert type, we already discussed undetected values. If you missed that, go back and check that. Really, really important that you understand how undetected values works, and that you understand that there's one extra nuance that I will add. If you have a grouping in your undetected value, or a grouping in your PromQL alert, so for example, like this, now undetected alerts will be grouped by continent. Okay, they will be grouped by continent. They won't be, if you get rid of the grouping, then you essentially, if any permutation of labels on load time, this load time label has like a permutation of labels is like a unique combination of values for all of the different labels attached to that metric. So if one of those combinations stops sending data, that counts as one undetected value. Remember, this is for the less than query as well. However, if you do an aggregation, for example, sum load time by continent, now we're saying, okay, if that continent stops sending data, then that counts as one undetected value. So be aware that the group by will change how undetected values are picked up. And so no grouping, you essentially have, you're tracking every single possible permutation of the labels on a given metric. With some grouping, it's on the grouping key. So in this case, content, it could be whatever the label is on the metric that's most appropriate for you. So that was some of the really obvious ones that we've just kind of gone through. Remember that if at any point you're feeling like this, you don't really understand what's going on, this button down here is super useful. Click this will take you to support. So you can send a message. We will reply very, very quickly. Our support is excellent, and they'll be able to help you with whatever the feature is that you're trying to understand. But just remember that if you're ever stuck or you see an issue that hasn't been covered in this video, feel free to just drop a message in there, and someone from the customer success team will make sure that you completely understand that. There's one other thing I'm going to add, which is the ratio alert. So get rid of that. So what the ratio alert does is essentially you define two queries. This is a log type alert, by the way. You define two queries. So for example, I'm going to say, let's just assume I'm all error logs. Okay, nice and easy. And query 2 is all info logs. Now, let's say I've got 1,000 error logs and 10,000 info logs. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin these around. It makes it a bit more easy. What I'm essentially saying there is I've got 10,000 info logs and I've got 1,000 error logs. What that means is that you're going to take 10,000 and divide it by 1,000. It's going to get you 10. Okay, that's going to get you your ratio. So for every one error log, there are 10 info logs. Okay, if you spin that around and you do error log first and then info, you're going to get a percentage because it's going to be 1,000 divided by 10,000. That's going to get you to 0.01. So the idea is that the ratio is the count of the first query divided by the count of the second query. Okay, really powerful for detecting things like error rates when the data is available in logs rather than in metrics and things like that. So it's just something to be aware of, just to make sure that you understand that. So that's the troubleshooting section. Hopefully you don't have to spend too much time in this section because you're having a really easy time with the alarms. But once again, if you are having trouble with any aspect of alerting, just go down here, check this out, and speak to one of our customer success teams. They'll be able to help you with any problems that you have. To wrap up this video, I thought I'd just show you 3 really nice use cases when you're working with alerts in Coralogix. The first is when you're using the custom dashboard screen. To arrive at the custom dashboard screen, you hover over dashboards and then to custom dashboards. Here we can see a dashboard that focuses on database performance. And down here there's this graph that tracks overall application activity. Now if you see something interesting here and you get used to this graph, what you can do is you can right click on any one of these items and click create alert. And you'll automatically get this really amazing graph come up and the ability to define a new threshold and a kind of walkthrough process that will allow you to define new alerts. This is really nice because it goes straight from your dashboard and your monitoring view to your alert definition view. Super powerful. The next is from the log screen. So for example, if you define a query up here, you're able to create alert directly. And just from this view and automatically copy the query in. Again, really nice. It essentially goes from where your data is, so you can kind of build your view up in the log explorer screen if you want, and then automatically define an alert, and it will create a standard alert. You notice the severities that are in the filters are already there, along with the query as well. That's a really nice way of just defining a very powerful a very powerful way of creating the alert automatically. And finally, the last one I want to show you is the insights view. So the insights view is essentially a different perspective on the alerts that have been generated. So you'll notice here some of the alerts that we've seen in previous screens: purchase impact, usability impact, and so on. But from the insight screen, you're able to set the status of an alert, and you're also able to assign it to a given user as well. So I can assign this particular alert to myself, and I can acknowledge it. So you get like a nice process workflow here as well. So Coralogix doesn't just enable you to define alerts and route the alert to either predefined or custom locations for self-remediation or further alerting. You can also do the full process control flow within Coralogix as well. So this is just 3 really nice use cases that add on and really add the value on to the Coralogix experience when using alerts. So that was just a quick run through of alerting in Coralogix. We did an overview of all the different types of alerts, which you can view in the new alert panel here. We did a deep dive into standard and metric alerts. And also we had a look at flow alerts and tracing alerts. And we had a little overview of the general configuration available for each of the different types of alerts, as well as some of the nuances for each of those types. And we wrapped up with some of the most common problems that people experience when they're using alerts in the Coralogix platform. Remember, alerts are all about giving your data a voice. But as with all things, it's important to get your alerting strategy right so that it's telling you often enough and loudly enough what's going wrong without giving you so much information that it deafens itself or it becomes a source of alert fatigue. Not only will our customer support help you with specific features in the platform, they may be able to give you advice about decent alert definitions as well. So remember that we're always here to help. We're really happy that you're using the Coralogix platform, and enjoy using one of the most sophisticated alerting suites on the observability market today.